It's Wednesday, May 5th, 2021, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kiely and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, Facebook's Oversight Board upholds the social network's decision to ban former President Trump. A memo sent to Washington Post newsroom employees gives the go-ahead to attend parades and parties this summer, but to be careful about possibly endorsing statehood. And the undefeated loses. Editor-in-Chief Kevin Merida is headed west to assume the helm of the Los Angeles Times. There's a lot more that I hope we'll get to before our half hour is up today, but I want to start with the case of the suspended cheerleader. No, really, we're going to lead our show today talking about a cheerleader from 40 miles outside of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Brandy Levy was 14 when she was cut from her high school's varsity cheer squad and relegated to the JV. She was, as a teen might be, disappointed, and she let loose with an 8-word message on Snapchat. 4 of those 8 words started with the letter F. The message was meant to disappear within 24 hours, as snaps on Snapchat do, but her coaches caught wind of it and suspended her from cheer for a full year. She sued, and a federal appeals court said that the school had violated her free speech rights. Now the question before the Supreme Court is how to protect the free speech rights of kids while not entirely stripping schools of the power to regulate behaviors like harassment and bullying. Now, Kathy, back in 1969, the standard for student speech in schools was set with the Tinker versus Des Moines case. And the standard there was that speech couldn't be disruptive. Is that the key word here too?
Well, I think, things have changed a lot since 1969. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there was no internet back then. But I think it's hard to make the case that this speech disrupts anything at this school. And I think the fact that an understandably upset little girl's perhaps inappropriate rant would lead to a 1-year suspension is why it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's what you see. You see people arguing about, should this be, is this free speech, isn't it? But I think the mistake here, and I think most people who are looking at this case, and even some of the justices have suggested, this is really not a case we want to use to decide a major First Amendment case. And what you can only hope is that the school would be a little more reasonable. I think if disruptive from the Tinker case, which had to do with armbands during the Vietnam War, is the standard, I think this can be no more disruptive of a school than an armband being worn to show political solidarity with the peace movement. So how this would in any way disrupt teaching at a public school is hard to understand. So we'll see.
An argument somebody else posed to me is in part that participating in cheerleading is an extracurricular at the school, much like being on a school basketball team or an athletic team, and that's a privilege. It's not a right. And that their perspective at that point was that the school maybe hadn't really done anything wrong because this student wasn't speaking about something directly related to a political issue or something else. That it was about participating in an extracurricular where there are policies about behavior.
Right. But it's interesting because Justice Kavanaugh, who actually coaches his daughter's junior high, I think junior high softball, one of those, basically kept saying during the arguments, but it is difficult when a kid of that age loses the opportunity to do something. This happens all the time. Parents get involved, the kids feel bad about it, that sort of thing. And sort of leaning toward, I think, what Kathy was talking about, which is, we are talking about something that happened online that didn't happen directly at the schools. It doesn't have an impact on the educational mission of what's happening within the school environment. and the difficulty in trying to police something that's happening within the social media environment is going to be hard for schools to be able to do, and even difficult for courts to be making decisions over.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It raises a real equity problem, because what are you going to do? I mean, we already know schools are underfunded. Are we going to have somebody who's paid to police the students' social media accounts? I mean, it leads down a path that I think none of us want to go. And I think I understand and appreciate where schools want to enforce standards and codes of behavior. But I think what happened here was it just was overblown. I mean, and that was the point. I think that it was Justice Kavanaugh who was making a full year.
Right.
for a rant on social media that was meant to disappear.
So, and I've been trying to think about this from every different perspective possible. And one of the other things I started thinking about, especially, is we're in the month of May, which in the television news world is sweeps, which is when you start to see some of the most sensational stories that you're ever going to see, that it's almost like a calendar, that we're going to start seeing those stories again about cyberbullying and what are schools doing to prevent it. And we hear the stories again and again about how schools can't act when students are perhaps going after another student. And, one of the other questions that I wonder if it's in part being looked at here is disruptive to whom? And in this case, was it necessarily disruptive to another student or impinging on another student's ability to go to school and receive an education in a safe environment? Perhaps not.
I think this is where I think it was Justice Alito was sort of leaning toward having to deal with that bullying and that sort of thing to make this sort of sweeping argument, legal argument, so that there could be some precedent there. But the problem, as some of the other justices pointed out, is that this might not be the case to actually do that. And that's where the problem is.
Okay, so early this morning, Facebook's oversight board upheld former President Trump's ban from that social network. Now, Kathy, this is something that a lot of people were like, yeah, he's off Facebook. But there's more to it than that. This review, which was to be binding, also is possibly up for review. This is not a permanent ban, if you will.
Yeah, social media can't live with Trump, can't live without him. I think this is the problem we've talked about before with Donald Trump and the media. As appalled as people might be, he's good for business, so they're not quite ready to put that crack pipe away. And so I think that's what you're seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting because they basically said, okay, 6 months from now, this committee,
he might be back,
which is funded by Facebook, is saying you need to make a decision about how you want to do this and set some sort of standard for how this will be dealt with in the future if we have another Trump-like politician
Trump
himself who does this. So, but it's interesting because Twitter basically said, nope, you're done. You're not coming back. We're not going to give it to you. We don't care what Facebook does. So, where is he to go? And I guess we'll see, because he's talking about building.
Well, and this is very typical of Facebook.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, they have of all the social media platforms, they have been the least willing to police their space.
Right.
Well, and so we know where he's going to go next, because yesterday Fox News in the afternoon broke this story that Trump was releasing his own platform, and this website went up yesterday. We have linked to it on our links blog if it's something that you want to find for yourself. And really, as others have started to and I don't know that a lot of the connections had been made when this was released yesterday, that the Facebook announcement was today. But if you go to this website, what you really see is that it's really nothing more than a blog that you, Ernest, or you, Kathy, or I could have set up with 15 minutes, okay, maybe an hour's worth of work sitting at a computer. And it's a lot of the releases that he has made since being off social media. And it's the same, language we've been used to for months and for years. Warmonger, Liz Cheney, some of the other names that you might see. So what felt yesterday like, this desperate attempt to come back was really an attempt to change the narrative on whatever this decision was going to be.
Get ahead of the Facebook story. Yeah, well, I mean, it is kind of funny because it's like Donald Trump meets the internet. And what he's set up is a website, which I think, as we now all know, is one of the in the current age, less effective ways to communicate, because certainly I just finished doing a media diary with my students, and not a single one of them listed going to a website of any sort as to how they get their news. They get links. They get links through social media, email, whatever. So Donald Trump can have a website, but how many people are actually going to look at it? That's a big question.
To me, I think Facebook's decision was important. Mm-hmm. It does have an impact on him, but because of his, I would just say, tremendous use of Twitter, being off of that platform has done more harm to his brand than being off of Facebook or any of the other things. And this website is not going to get him into that space that he so coveted while president.
Interesting, because I will say I spent a little bit too much time on it yesterday, trying to decide yesterday if we were going to talk about this, and today's developments changed my mind. This website, if you were to go on it, you will see that for each of the posts to what is ostensibly this blog, you can share the posts as the visitor to Facebook or to Twitter. So the two primary mainstream social media platforms that he has been banned from. There are no sharing tools to any of the other sites, the Parlors or some of the others that have emerged that his base is using. And there's also the heart button that we have all come as social media users to know as the like button. But it doesn't do anything. It doesn't go to anything. It's not functional. It's just there as an image.
So one of the things I'm curious about, and just based on when we were looking at it just before the show, I couldn't tell, but it didn't look like the photographs, which are beautiful, were credited. And I don't know, I'd have to go look at it, but those look very much like official White House photos to me.
Which would be in the public domain.
True, yeah, but no credit. So just saying on a website, that's something we teach in journalism school. You should credit the work.
Okay, true there. So as we've been talking about a couple of free speech issues, I have one more that I want to talk about. It's a memo that was sent to the Washington Post newsroom staffers this week. And at first, it seemed innocent enough. It reminded people that it's one thing to attend a parade this summer to celebrate Juneteenth commemorations or Pride celebrations, but to avoid protests. And okay, so here's where the memo took a bit of a left turn. To avoid any demonstrations advocating for statehood in D.C. Now, the full memo is on our links blog, along with some really thought-provoking responses from journalists that were on Twitter as different threads. Ernest, what's your take when you read this memo?
To me, it's one of those things where you're trying to me, I guess they put it out there to try to avoid any kind of political statement in support of or not in support of DC statehood, which has been a hot button issue for a long time, in particular, not only within the district, but within Congress, because every year you have the DC representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eleanor.
My congresswoman for many years. Yeah.
Who puts that out? Who puts that up as a bill, as an amendment to grant DC statehood. Now, for the first time in a long time, there is a momentum to do that, and the one person blocking it again is Manchin from West Virginia. He's the one Democrat saying, I don't know if I kind of want this to go through. And so now it's become a big issue. But you have people who work at the Washington Post who live in the district who may feel one way or another about it, and their company is basically saying, we want you to stay out of this.
Which I guess I can understand on some level, but to wrap it up around Juneteenth and Pride celebrations, you're allowed
because there's an expectation that statehood is going to be a part of these events.
And there's something different about those two issues. I mean,
And I guess that's why it bothers me a little to wrap them all up.
But I think what the Post was trying to say was, I mean, it was probably dumb to put them all in the same memo.
Yeah.
But Juneteenth and Pride have to do with identity. You can live in Bethesda, Maryland, or you can live in the district, or as I used to like to call it when I lived there, the colony of Columbia. Or you can live in Arlington, Virginia, if you don't want to not have voting representation in Congress. But this is a hot issue. It's obviously going to be an issue that the Post is going to have to cover. And, this is a continuing debate in journalism. We are talking about it a lot in our classrooms, is this question of objectivity or neutrality and identity. And so, it's still an unanswered question, but the Post is an old school journalism publication, and they are looking at this for all the reasons that Earnest identified, saying this is going to be a big story for us. If you want to cover it, and this is something we talk about in the newsroom, don't give somebody an excuse not to give you the interview. Right. So if you feel that strongly about D.C. statehood, go ahead. But if I'm the editor, you're not going to be a byline on that story.
Yeah.
Okay. So while we're talking about the Washington Post, I want to talk about a story that it retracted last week, along with both NBC and the New York Times. And CNN. That Rudy Giuliani had been briefed by the FBI that he was the target of a Russian disinformation campaign. How does this even happen for organizations this big, the gold standard in our country, to all get this wrong? A story of this level in this proportion.
Well, first the Washington Post gets one of its sources, one of its trusted sources, as it is said, to provide them with this information, and because this is a trusted source, they go with it. Then you have all the other news operations trying to play catch up, and Dean Baquet, who executive editor of the New York Times, basically came out and said, look, we were caught in the trying to catch up mode and got pulled into it as well. And all the other news organizations get pulled in. It's a classic. It continues to happen. And oftentimes it happens because you go to a trusted source who provides information, and that information is wrong, and you go with it. And then everyone else is playing catch up, and they go to their trusted sources who also want to be in the game as well, and they confirm what's already been out there, and the wrong story just continues to perpetuate.
So we actually have two competing, yet at the same time complementary problems going on at once. We have that issue of the competitive forces, and we have anonymous sourcing coming into play.
Right.
Yeah, and and it's highly likely it was all the same source, I would say, and so when you're working in an area where the sourcing is that limited, the reporters are not stupid. They're all going to the same, So I think, there was probably one source who was wrong, and so these things can happen. But I think what Earnest described, it can tend to happen more often now because we say in newsrooms, speed kills, and the internet and the competitive pressure has increased the temptation to go faster than we should. So how many sources do you have on that story? Is it more than one source? Okay, it's a really trusted source. How does that source know it?
Right.
And I think that's a question that we often don't answer. And I can remember when I was working at USA Today, a terrible mistake that was made when there were miners caught underground in a terrible mine accident, and it was a national drama trying to get them out. And the headline in USA Today was, "They're free," and they weren't. Most of them were dead. And the mistake was because the reporters were waiting and late at night, it was on deadline, and somebody comes walking up the hill and tells them this, and it was Governor Joe Manchin, then the governor of West Virginia. And he had bad information. So the question is always, how do you know that? Even if it's an authority, how do you know? Right. And when you're working on a very fast deadline and you're trying to compete, sometimes you forget to ask.
Okay. So there is soon to be a new executive editor at the Los Angeles Times, someone who is pretty well known to some at this table, Kevin Merida. Ernest, you and he go way back. Tell us a little bit about him.
Kevin Merida, I think he's going to be great for the LA
Yeah.
Times. It's something that they needed. I mean, there were a lot of people who were jockeying for that position. Kevin and I were friends back in the old NBJ days, back when I was at the Houston Chronicle. Kevin was I think at the time,
Dallas
Morning News.
Yeah.
He was at the Dallas Morning News when I was at the Fort Worth Telegram as an intern and was working with a good friend of his who was one of my editors.
Right.
And he has since moved to several different places.
Sure.
One at the Washington Post. Found himself at the Undefeated, helped pull that basically pull it out of the ditch, because
we're going to talk about that part in a second.
And so I think he's going to be great for the LA Times in the sense that it needs some stability. It needs someone there who can help it find the stability and direction to become the voice for the West Coast, because right now there really isn't one. The LA Times has always wanted to be that voice out west and be able to compete with the New York Times and with the Washington Post. And now that it has the funding to do it, it needs someone to provide the direction. I think Kevin can do that.
Talk a little bit about some of your experiences and having worked with him or having been around him here when he was here on campus as one of our 2018 honor medalists.
Well, I also know Kevin going way back. There's no neutrality at this table about Kevin Merida.
That's okay. That's not all.
Yeah, we have to be honest.
We're being subjective here. We are being upfront about our biases. This is a good thing. We like this guy, and we're honest about it. Go ahead.
Total transparency. So I also go way back, and I've known Kevin since he was working at the Dallas Morning News, and I was at the Houston Post. And he's the total package. I mean, I think the really interesting thing about Kevin is he has done everything in media. He's been a traditional ink on paper reporter. He's written books. He's helped produce TV shows. And he's
brought a lot of good people into the profession.
Yes, he absolutely has. And he is a very well-liked person. I can remember when I was mentoring high school students at a high school in Washington, D.C., and they were going to get to go for a tour of the Washington Post, where Kevin was working at the time. And I called Kevin up about one particular young man who I thought was, and I said, could you just put your arm around him and talk to him? And of course he did. He gave him a huge tour. So, I mean, he's always been willing to help out younger people. We certainly saw it here, as you said, at Mizzou when he was here. So I think he is going to be a terrific developer of talent for LA, and he also understands the need for convergence. He's got it all, and he's a nice guy to boot.
Right.
He's leaving a big gap at the Undefeated.
He is. Then the ESPN is going to be trying to fill that void. They need someone there because, ESPN has these contracts with, in particular, the NBA, that in which you have a property that you're working with, that you're trying to understand their connection to race, their connection to social movements, their connection to social media. And the Undefeated was one of the things that gave them that sort of outlet to be able to do that and to bring up a lot of young talent in the way in which they need to have that. And they're gonna need to have someone running the Undefeated that will continue to build that out. Otherwise, they're going to lose that kind of connection that they've made to many of the contractor properties that they've worked with.
And in some ways too, could lose ESPN and the Undefeated could lose ground to publications like the Players Tribune, where they just go and speak for themselves in their own voice and in their own platform.
Right.
Well, I think, it's on ESPN. I mean, Kevin built that, and I think any big organization has to be thinking succession all the time. And, and really, for Kevin, this is an opportunity. One of the other things is he moved from news to sports.
Right.
So he is really prepared to run a large, multifaceted, multimedia news organization, and he should. And he's left a great blueprint. And it takes somebody else now to move on. But every big media organization needs to be thinking about succession and who's going to step in.
And you're really starting to see this now. I mean, the LA Times had this issue. They've now filled that with Kevin. The New York Times has already said that Dean McKay is going to be exiting at some point, and they're going to have to find a succession. The Washington Post and Marty Barron. They're still looking for someone right now. So you're having all of this happen right now. I mean, NBC, same issue. They were able to find someone, person of color, to come in and be able to hopefully build that out. All of these media operations are now dealing with what is the succession plan, who's going to be coming in next, what are they going to do, but not only that, how's that going to play out in terms of what does it look like as they move into the next phases of the
And I think this is where we've been bad in the business at training.
Right.
Training and preparing people to succeed. And I think if this triggers people to do that, that's a great thing for the media business.
Right.
Okay, so before we go today, I want to take a few minutes to remember a journalist taken from us way too soon. KBIA listeners probably remember Aviva Okeson-Haberman. She was a reporter here through her time at the Missouri School of Journalism until 2019. She died on April 25th, 2 days after she was struck by a stray bullet inside her Kansas City home. During her time here at KBIA, Aviva did some magnificent reporting alongside Kyra Haas on the struggles caregivers of those with autism face, and an award-winning piece investigating the unanswered calls to the state's elder abuse hotline. Here's News Director Ryan Famuliner.
You would have never guessed that she was somebody that was such a firm and dogged reporter, because she was just so kind and gracious and just a joy to be around. We've lost a force for good for nothing, for something that shouldn't have happened. She should be here.
So Aviva's loss is profound, and it's profound for a lot of us here, myself included. She was one of my students. But one thing that I noticed in reading her death notice that her family had placed in the Springfield News Leader is that they were seeking donations to the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. And to me, that's a reminder that regardless of how profound our loss is right now, Aviva's loss is one of hundreds, if not thousands, that others across the country are experiencing every day to acts of gun violence as well. And one of the biggest tributes we can pay as journalists and as journalism educators is to really rethink how we cover gun violence in this country.
Yeah, there's a piece on our Links blog by Kyle Pope and from the Columbia Journalism Review talking about how journalism needs to rethink how it covers gun violence. We cover it in sort of this episodic way, or we either pop in or we pop out, and we talk about the what happens in the moment, but not think about it from a long-term perspective, which is something I think definitely we need to do, and talk about it in terms of policy and what's not being done, and how that gets stifled each and every time we have these horrific instances of gun violence, whether you're talking about the individual in this particular case, or you talk about the mass shootings that we covered ad nauseum. I mean, there was a lull during the pandemic, but just since the pandemic, it has really exploded.
And the violence there wasn't a lull in the violence.
No.
There was a lull in the coverage because
right.
journalists were busy covering other things.
The best way to pay tribute to Aviva is to continue the work.
Exactly. Okay. Well, we are out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about each of the topics we talked about on our Links blog. That's on the KBIA website at kbia.org. You can also listen to us again wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. I'd like to thank RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, Aaron Hay for handling the audio, and Tim Pilcher for our theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll see you again next week for another edition of Views of the News.